Principles and Elements of Design, Part 1, Repetition, Harmony, and Contrast. But there also may be other things that I'll be showing you which are not listed here. Hello, I'm Charles Bernard, and welcome to this video. Design means many things. In its simplest sense, it means 1, 2, or 3 objects, repeated over and over again, as in a pattern on wallpaper, for example. When we speak of design in a picture, we are still speaking of elements that are rhythmically repeated, but it is not a dull repetition like the pattern on a wallpaper. Rather, it is repetition with variation. A good picture must be interesting, and variety of design is one of our key tools in making it so. I'm starting with the elements of picture making. There are many more than what you see here, but I'm starting out with these. These principles of design that you see are the main ones. There are other principles, but I'm limiting myself to the main ones here. And these are the ones that you usually hear about as being principles of design. Then there are these, the elements of design, and with these, you create the images in your pictures. All images have these elements of design. The images change. Let's say the image of a tree, the image of a house, the image of a mountain, the image of a figure. They're all different images, but all of them have these elements of design as part of them. While the images change, the elements of design do not. If you ever hope to paint really great pictures, or just really good ones, then you need to learn the principles of design. For without a knowledge, an understanding of them, and an ability to apply them to your own paintings and drawings, you won't be able to produce art. That's how important they are. There is no art without the principles of design. All good and great artists throughout the centuries have known about them and have been able to apply them to their work. And that's one of the main reasons why their work is so great. When you respond positively to a work of art, it is largely due to the fact that the work of art embodies these principles of design. That's what you're responding to. There are, of course, other elements of picture making that I'll be introducing you to that are also part of a good or great painting. But these are among the most important elements, the principles of design. There are 8 principles of design, and there are 7 elements of design. Now I'll quickly go through them. There's dominance, there's balance, there's repetition, unity, harmony, alternation, contrast, and gradation. A great painting is not the result of accident or some kind of mysterious gut feeling that you have that enables you to produce something really great because it feels right to you. Working by instinct, working from intuition, working from a gut feeling as to what you think is right, whether that actually is right or not that you're doing will depend on your knowledge and understanding that you've gained about the elements of picture making. Once you know them, understand them, and are able to apply them, they become part of your subconscious. And then your instinct or intuition, your feeling as to what should be done, will be reliable because it is based on sound knowledge and an understanding of what needs to be done. But if you don't have that knowledge, you don't have that understanding of the elements of picture making, then your instinct that you're working by or your gut feeling is not reliable. And you're hoping that something great or good will result from accident, and it just won't happen. If you think all you need to do is just add some colors and some textures and maybe a shape over here and a shape over there, and you'll wind up with a work of art. Well, it's like taking a bunch of bricks and just throwing them on a pile, and just keep throwing them, and hoping that what you're going to wind up eventually with, when you've thrown enough bricks on that pile, is a house. It just won't happen. It's the same basic sort of thinking that if I just start applying some shapes and colors and values and so forth, I'm going to wind up with a work of art. It won't happen. It will only happen when you understand what the elements of picture making are and are able to apply them. Then after you've done tremendous amounts of practice work where you've tried to consciously get as many of these elements of picture making into your pictures, will painting become more automatic on your part. That is, you won't be doing as much conscious thinking as to what shapes should be used or where that color should be placed or where that value should be placed. You'll be working largely from instinct. But as I mentioned, it will be a reliable instinct because of all the work that you've done where you tried consciously to apply these elements of picture making to your practice work. They will become part of your memory, and they'll enter into your work without having to do as much conscious thinking as you had to do when you were first learning these elements of picture making and trying to get them into your pictures. What is a principle of design? A principle of design is defined as a law of relationship or a plan of organization. The principles of design organize the elements of design. Art is man-made order. Therefore, you need to learn how organization is achieved within a composition. And the way it's achieved is by forming relationships which occur when connections between the elements of design that you see listed here are made. I'm going to begin by showing you simple abstract examples, and it is through more simple examples that things can be more easily and more quickly understood, and then later I'll be showing you actual pictures to which these things are applied. Now, a unit such as this has various dimensions. It has shape, it has value, it has direction, which is a vertical direction, upwards like this. It has a particular size. It has a texture, in this case a very smooth texture, and it has a color, as well as the last dimension, which is line. It has 7 dimensions. In repetition, you repeat each one of these dimensions in the other unit, which is this one. And this creates repetition. Now, the other way in which the elements of design can be combined is to form harmony. Here, there is still exact repetition. But in order to create harmony, one of the dimensions that I listed needs to be changed. If only one dimension is changed, harmony is created, and you no longer have exact repetition. What you have is the introduction of change or contrast. And harmony involves both repetition and contrast. If I change more than one dimension, I still have harmony, but less harmony. The more dimensions I change, the less harmony there is. The more similar the units are, the more harmony there is, until they become exactly alike, and then you wind up with repetition instead of harmony. Now I'm going to change just one of the dimensions, and that dimension will be size. And I'll bring down the size a little bit. Harmony results from elements of design that look similar when a little bit of change has taken place, and not too much change. Then you have harmony, such as in this case now. I changed one of the dimensions, and that dimension was size, but all the other dimensions have been kept the same. The dimension of direction has been kept the same. That hasn't changed. The shape hasn't changed. The texture hasn't changed. The smooth surface texture. The color hasn't changed. The value hasn't changed. Everything remains the same except for size. In spite of the differences that are introduced into the units, which means contrast is introduced, and there can be more or less contrast introduced. But in spite of that, harmony can be maintained if those differences are not too great, and the units continue to look similar. Now, if I want more change to be introduced, I can change another dimension, which is value. For example, if I turn these into gray, you can see that both have the same value. If I make a change to one of these values, then that value needs to be changed just a little bit in order to maintain a harmony of values. There is still a harmony of sizes because the sizes of the shapes are similar. But if I want to maintain a harmony of values, then one of the values that I change needs to look similar to the other in order to achieve harmony. So if I change, let's say, the smaller size to a slightly darker value, something like that, I have harmony in spite of making that value darker. It hasn't been made so dark that there is no longer a similarity of values, which would result in a relationship that is not harmonious. And here's what it looks like in color. You can see that it's a darker value, and there's a nice pleasing relationship between these shapes. Change has been introduced, and there is no longer exact repetition like in this example here, but here there is repetition with variation, or as it's also called, varied repetition or harmonic repetition. And this kind of repetition with variation is more interesting than this kind of repetition where nothing changes, where each of the dimensions are repeated and there is no change introduced. I'm going to change another dimension in this harmony, and that dimension will be color. The large triangle will be changed to a red-violet. And by introducing another change, I've created more variety. And the more variety that is added, the more interesting this arrangement becomes. There's a similarity between the colors. And again, as I mentioned before, harmony is the result of elements of design that are similar, where the differences aren't too great, where there isn't a lot of contrast, just a little bit of contrast that has been introduced. These colors are closely related on the color wheel. Here is the color wheel, and you can see those colors down here. They are next to each other. All the colors on this color wheel that are next to each other, such as the yellow, yellow-green, or yellow-orange and yellow, or yellow-green and green, they are in harmony because they are next to each other on the color wheel. Therefore, they are closely related. And I highly suggest that you memorize this color wheel, because it's going to be very useful to you. There are other color wheels, but the Munsell color wheel is the one that I like the best and the one that I find most useful. If you use colors that are diametrically opposite each other, such as yellow and violet, then you won't be able to achieve this kind of harmony. The harmony is the result of colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. Although you could use a color that's a little further away, but the farther away you get from one of the colors that are dominant within your arrangement, such as yellow, for example, then the less and less harmony will be the result of the arrangement in terms of color. Here is a rough color sketch that I did of an astronaut that has crash landed, and he manages to survive and get out of the spacecraft, but only to be greeted by an imminent danger that awaits him. Using this color sketch, I'll show you how harmony can be created and maintained within the composition in spite of the introduction of strong contrasts. It is what I talked about using this diagram here, where I showed you that some dimensions are harmonized while others contrast. But in spite of that, the organization of the whole remains harmonious. I use a limited number of colors for this color scheme, which are yellow, blue, violet, and red-violet. When you work with a restricted or limited range of colors, make sure that that range extends far enough to include a balancing warm color to the cool colors or a cool color to the warm colors. In my color scheme, that balancing color is the yellow. In this diagram, there is color harmony because, as I mentioned earlier, within this blue-violet, there is red and blue. And within this red-violet, there is red and blue. So the two primaries, red and blue, are common to both of these colors, and therefore the colors are closely related and in harmony. In my color sketch, the same occurs. The dominant colors, or group of colors can be dominant if they are closely related, such as in my case, where violet and red-violet are the dominating colors. However, one color more than the other should dominate in terms of taking up more area. And in my color sketch, that color is the violet. There is more violet than there is red-violet. The idea is to create irregular intervals of sizes of areas of color, so that no two areas of color have the same size or take up the same amount of area. Harmony can be seen throughout my color sketch. It is created by the closely related colors of red, violet, and violet. The blue that I used here on the figure, as well as these figures and then other parts of this color sketch that I'm outlining here, that is also related to the violet and the red-violet because there is blue within the violet and the red-violet. However, the blue is not as closely related to the violet and the red-violet as is the red-violet to violet. But nevertheless, it's still in harmony with those colors. Varied repetition can be found within harmony. And my color sketch is predominantly harmonious, within which varied repetition can be found. Using this diagram, if you remember, I talked about certain dimensions are harmonized while others are in sharp contrast. And this is what occurs in my color sketch. Certain dimensions, such as color, shape, or value, are harmonized while others are not. But if you remember, I said that even though some dimensions may not be in harmony with others, that doesn't mean that the arrangement as a whole is not harmonious. Because if they don't harmonize in one dimension, they will harmonize in another dimension. Therefore, or thereby connecting them, uniting them through those other dimensions that they have in common. The shape of this figure here has a curving character to it. It is a curved shape. But other shapes in this composition, like this large shape of the crashed spaceship, has an angular character to it. Since these two shapes contrast sharply with each other, they need to be harmonized. But how do you harmonize two contrasting shapes? If you've been following what I've been saying, you'll know the answer to this question. If you look at this diagram here, both shapes have the same character. But if I changed this triangle to a circle, I now have a circular shape in contrast to a triangle shape. The two shapes contrast strongly with each other, just as these shapes do in my color sketch. In this example, now that I've changed the small triangle to a circle, even though they are contrasting in shape, they harmonize in color because the two colors are closely related on the color wheel. They are in harmony because each contains the primary colors of red and blue. And so it is in my color sketch. The blue color on the figure relates to the violet color and red-violet in this contrasting shape. The two colors are in harmony, just as these two colors are in harmony. So these contrasting shapes in my color sketch are harmonized through the dimension of color, because both share the same color, which is blue. The figure is blue, and there is blue in violet. However, it is not only through the dimension of color that the two opposing shapes are harmonized, but also through the dimension of value. They both share a similar value. This harmonious relationship in the diagram can be strengthened by giving both a similar value or repeating the same value. By darkening this value here to something like this, now there is a stronger bond between the two than there was before, because a similar dimension, that of value, has been repeated. I'll change this to a grayscale so that you can see how similar these values are. You see, this value is similar to this value, and just as in this diagram where these values are similar. They're almost the same. I can't harmonize these two shapes through texture because the texture on the figure is a soft texture. His clothing is soft compared to the hard metal texture of the spacecraft. So through the dimension of texture, they cannot be harmonized, but through value and color, they can. While the textures contrast sharply with each other, one is soft and the other is hard, color and value, those dimensions are similar or the same. So you see, the units within a composition can contrast in one dimension and contrast sharply, but harmonize in other dimensions. And this is what I've been showing you all along using this diagram as an example. But now you're seeing it being applied to an actual painting. While there are these angular shapes that dominate this composition, there are also shapes that oppose them, and they are the curved shapes, as I've already pointed out with the man. And then there are curved shapes found in these sand dunes. The way these sand dunes are harmonized with the contrasting shapes of the spacecraft are through the dimension of color. Red-violet found on the spacecraft is repeated within the sand dunes, thereby harmonizing the two contrasting shapes. The yellow sun is harmonized not through color, because the hue is so different from the other hues found elsewhere in the composition that you can't harmonize this yellow curved shape with other hues. Or, put another way, through the dimension of color. As long as you have another area or shape or form that a contrasting hue, such as this yellow curved shape, can harmonize with, it will not remain isolated and will become part of the greater whole. In this case, the value of this yellow sun is similar to the value found at the horizon by the sand dunes here. Therefore, I'm connecting or harmonizing this yellow sun to a part of the composition, which is this horizon. Also, because of the curved shape, it harmonizes with the curved shape of the figure, as well as the curved shape of the sand dunes. Therefore, this yellow sun does not remain isolated from the rest of the composition. It is tied in with other parts of the composition, not through the dimension of hue or color, but through other dimensions such as the value and the shape. By repeating that circle throughout the composition, I'm further tying in the circle of the sun with other parts of the composition, and further ensuring that this circular yellow sun shape is not isolated from the rest of the composition. The yellow hue of the sun acts as a hue discord, which enriches the harmony of the whole. It adds variety and zest to the color design. It can also add vigor, vitality, and interest to the color design. So a hue discord has an important function within the harmony of a color design. In addition to the yellow discord, I also added a green and yellow-green discord, as well as a small bright red accent. It's not really a discord because the color is not sufficiently different enough from the others to be a discord hue. But it adds a nice little accent here, which helps to increase the interest. As for the sky area, it has been harmonized with other parts of the composition through the dimension of color as well as shape, because the sky has an angular or triangular shape to it, just as other parts of the composition have triangular or angular shapes. Such as I have already pointed out, this spaceship, and this is triangular here, or angular shapes all over. It is the red-violet in the sky that is repeated throughout other parts of the colored sketch, with variations of this red-violet, where in some places the red-violet is brighter, in others it's more neutralized or it has been grayed more. But in spite of its variations, it remains closely related to the other colors found in other parts of the composition, and therefore harmonizes with those other parts. When you select a discord or discordant colors to be notes of color within your color design, make sure that they are far enough removed from the dominant or subordinate colors, which in my case are these colors here. And the yellow and green and yellow-green actually are the discord
colors, and they are far enough removed from these dominant colors to not be confused with them. They must read clearly, and they do in my color sketch. If a discordant color is small enough, like this gun here in my color sketch, then you may be able to get away without trying to harmonize it with something else in the composition. Since a color discord should act as a kind of irritant within the color design, by not harmonizing it with something else, it becomes more of an irritant. But remember, this only works for very small color discords. If they are larger, like the yellow sun here, then you need to harmonize them with something else. Here is another version of the sketch. As you can see, I changed the color in the sky and the ground area. I used a stronger character contrast, which gives me a different mood from the previous sketch. In this one, the mood is more exciting, more dramatic, because of the strong contrast of warm and cool colors that do not exist to this extreme in the previous sketch. More warm colors are introduced, and they take up a larger area. They appear in the sky and the ground area here. There's an orange color that I added, which contrasts sharply with its complement blue on the figure. There are more complementary colors, which help to create a more exciting mood. The yellow is a complement to the violet found on the spacecraft. So there are two sets of complements. The blue with the orange in the sky, and the yellow with the violet on the spacecraft. The orange color in the sky has a brighter intensity, but it is not of maximum intensity. You see this orange that I'm indicating now? How much brighter that orange is than the orange in the sky. So the orange in the sky has been reduced in its intensity, but it still looks somewhat bright compared to the other colors. But this orange color is harmonized with a contrasting color of red-violet through their similarity of intensity, but also because there is red in the orange and there is red within the red-violet, as well as in the violet. And that common color, the primary color of red that appears in all of these colors, helps to harmonize the sky color with the rest of the color. Although the harmony isn't very strong because the orange is a little distance away from the red-violet. The closer colors are on the color wheel, the more harmonious they are. The farther away they are, the less harmonious they are. Here's the other version, and you can see the mood is somewhat more tranquil compared to this mood. The result of all that I've been talking about, and that I have done in this color sketch, is varied repetition. Harmony is varied repetition. And I have shown you how this can be achieved. In this case, there is very strong contrast resulting in what is called discord. Discord is extreme contrast, where all the dimensions of each unit are completely different from the other unit. They have nothing in common, and therefore they are not in harmony, but they are in extreme contrast. This shape here, in the middle of these, represents harmony. And I did this diagram this way to show you that harmony lies between repetition, which results in monotony, and extreme contrast, which is discord. Harmony lies between these two extremes. It combines the character of both monotony or repetition and extreme contrast or discord. So to get that point across, I combine some of what is in this shape and this shape with this shape. And therefore I have part of the shape a straight diagonal and then the other part a curve. So it combines some of the extremes of both of these shapes, which harmony requires. Different degrees of contrast and repetition can be introduced, as I pointed out here. This arc value is a greater contrast than the size differences or the shape differences. So different degrees of contrast can be introduced into a harmonious arrangement to make that arrangement even more interesting. If there is too much harmony and too little contrast, then there will not be enough interest because there isn't enough variety. But when you introduce major and minor contrasts, then the interest is increased because there is a greater amount of variety and you wind up with harmonic repetition or varied repetition, which is the most interesting kind of repetition. Now, if you combine all your elements of design within your composition to form a lot of different contrasts like this, these different units will all be competing for attention. These units are all competing, first of all, through their size. Because each shape is of the same size, each shape is commanding the same amount of attention. If I made one shape larger, then there would be one shape that commands more attention than the others. But that's not the case. Also, each color has the same amount of intensity. The intensity of this red is the same as the blue, and the blue intensity is the same as the yellow. They're all bright intensities, although the yellow is the brightest. But there isn't enough variety of intensities here, where one intensity of color will stand out more than the other. They're too similar in intensity for any one to stand out more than the other. Therefore, they're all fighting for attention in terms of intensity as well as size. And each unit is a different shape, and there is no one shape that is commanding more attention than another. So therefore, they're also competing in terms of shape for attention. And each one of these shapes is, of course, a different color. There is no one color that stands out more than any other. Therefore, they're also competing in terms of color. Each one wants the same amount of attention. All these conflicts that I've pointed out to you that exist within these units can be resolved through dominance and through imposing a plan of organization upon the elements in conflict. So you see what happens when you introduce too much of this contrast. Then you get this kind of competition that's going on between all the elements of design. So keep your contrasts under control, but you have to introduce enough contrast, like I did here, in order to make your composition interesting. Otherwise, you wind up with dull repetition like this. When you're talking about a law of relationship, you're talking about how the elements of design can be combined. And there are only three ways in which they can be combined. They can be combined to look identical, they can be combined to look similar, or they can be combined to look like they are contrasting with each other or in conflict with each other. I take this shape and I repeat it once, and then let's say I repeat it again. What I've done is I've combined these shapes to appear identical. So that's one way in which you can combine the elements of design, to make them look identical. Let me give you a concrete example of this abstraction here, how it would look in an actual painting. And here is a quick
rough sketch that I did of this figure. Now if I take that figure and I repeat it once and then again, what I have now is essentially what I have over here in this abstraction. I've combined these figures in such a way that they appear identical, just as these squares here appear identical. So that's one way of combining these figures. But this kind of exact repetition is too monotonous. They look too much the same, and therefore this makes for a boring composition. This is what you need to avoid if you want to avoid a boring looking picture. Remember that a principle of design is a law of relationship or a plan of organization. You need to organize your composition. And the way it's organized is by way of a plan. The plan can consist of combining the elements of design, like you see here, so that they appear identical, just like in my sketch here. That is a plan that brings order to the elements of design. But it's a rather boring plan. So, in order to make it more interesting, you need to introduce variation. And that is the other way in which the elements of design can be combined. They can be combined to look similar, but not identical, which results in harmony, which is what you see right here. You can see that the shapes look similar, but not the same like up here. I've changed the values and the shapes themselves, as well as the intervals of space that you see here between the shapes. The shapes here have been changed somewhat. This is wider, this is narrower. The sizes have been changed. This is larger, this is a medium size, this is smaller, but they haven't been changed so much that the sizes don't look somewhat similar. And the values, how light or how dark these shapes are, have been changed somewhat, but again, not so much that they don't look similar. Harmony is the result of having the elements of design look similar, not too different. So this is a way in which you can combine the elements of design, and I'll show you an example of what that looks like in my rough sketch here by changing this. I'll introduce variation. You can see that I've made some changes, and now the figures have been combined to form harmony, whereas before they were combined to form repetition, like that. This arrangement makes for a more interesting arrangement than this one. Here there isn't any variation, but here I've introduced variation of size and value, just as I did over here with these shapes. You can see that the value of this figure is a bit lighter in value than this one, or this one, which is the darkest, just as I introduced variations of value over here, as well as variations of size. The sizes are not too radically different from each other. They need to be similar in order to form a harmonious relationship. If the sizes are too different, then they won't look harmonious. Looking at this value here, I think I'm going to make that a little bit darker in value, like this, so that it is in an even closer relationship with the other values. I think it was a little too light for it to be in harmony with the others, and the middle shape I'm also making a bit darker. I think now there's a more harmonious relationship between these values. They're more similar in value now. This is actually a judgment call on the part of the artist, where he or she needs to determine how much change can be introduced and still have a harmonious relationship between the values or shapes or colors between the elements of design. Before, there is no longer a harmonious relationship between them. Art is not an exact science, like physics is, for example. By repeating this figure and varying it in terms of size and value, but keeping the same shape, I've set up a rhythm, and the result, therefore, is a rhythmic composition. I have repetition, but I have repetition with variation, and therefore the result is rhythm, as well as harmony. And now it's time for the next way in which the elements of design can be combined, and that is called discord, or it's also referred to sometimes as novelty or contrast, but an extreme contrast. There are different degrees of contrast, and discord is the most extreme contrast, and therefore the word discord is, I think, the best one to use. So that is another way in which the elements of design can be combined. And now we come to the third way in which the elements of design can be combined. And they can be combined to look totally different, which means that they are combined to form contrast. And since they're being combined to look totally different, I'm referring to extreme contrast, which is referred to as discord. Sometimes when I talk about the different ways in which the elements of design can be combined, I may refer to this third way as contrast rather than discord. But discord actually describes it better, since the elements are totally different, and discord refers to extreme contrast. So I'll be using the word discord here. Some artists use the word novelty, which is also good because novelty means introducing something new. And when you're combining the elements of design that introduce something that's totally different, you're introducing something new. Here you see an example of how the elements of design have been combined so that they appear to look totally different, which results in discord. The difference among these three fundamental forms of relationship is one of degree of interval and the kind and number of intervals involved. This kind of different degrees of intervals of contrast can be seen between these shapes and values. And I brought in this value scale here to show you what I'm talking about when I'm talking about different degrees of intervals of contrast. For example, the triangle and the circle are in greater contrast than the circle and the rectangle, or the rectangle and the triangle, because the triangle and the circle not only differ greatly in their sizes, but also in their values. As you can see, one is black and the other is white. But the value of the rectangle here is gray, a middle value that is more closely related to the white and the black than the black is to the white of the circle. And the rectangle shape is more closely related to the triangle shape than the rectangle is to the circle shape. If you look over here where the 9 value scale is, you can see how far apart the white is from the black down here, which results in this long interval of space between them. And therefore, they are in extreme contrast, or discord. The value of this rectangle here, which is what I'm going to pick up and then add it over to the value scale right there. You see that value is a middle value falling halfway between the white at the top and the black at the bottom. Therefore, the interval space between the white at the top and that gray is much less than the interval of space between the white and the black down here. So it's a different interval of space between those two values. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about different intervals of contrast. These differences in the amount of space between the various values, resulting in different degrees of value contrast. And the same goes for shapes. Here you see various shapes arranged around a circle, and the differences in the intervals between these shapes determines how much contrast there is between them, how closely they are related to each other, or how far apart they are, how little they relate to each other. So the circle doesn't relate very closely with the triangle down here because they are too far apart. And that's the kind of shape contrast that I pointed out to you over here. So this is a long interval of space between these two shapes. Now, if I have an interval that is shorter, like the circle and this shape here, there is less contrast between these two shapes, and therefore they are in harmony, while these two are in discord. Here you see an example of different shape intervals, while previously, right here, you saw an example of different value intervals. This kind of different intervals also pertains to the rest of the elements of design, such as line and texture and color, for example, as well as direction. But here I'm giving you a couple of examples so that you understand what I meant by the different intervals resulting in different degrees of contrast. I made a couple more changes. The figure was enlarged even more, and the intervals of space between these figures right here has been varied more. There's more space here and less right there. And you can see that over here in this example when I pointed out that there was more space here than here. So there's a variation of space, of intervals of space that you find here. Now there are many other elements of design that I could change, but I'm limiting myself now to just a few. So with these few, you get an idea of how elements can be combined to form harmony so that they appear more similar looking. But now it's time to move on to another example in which I show you how the elements of design can be combined to appear dissimilar. And here is the third way in which things can be combined. Now, it's not just the elements of design that you see here, but all the things that you put into your pictures can be combined to look different. Here I've introduced novelty or contrast. When I say novelty, I essentially mean contrast. For example, I've introduced a female figure here. And that is a novelty that I've added to the picture. I've also changed the pose of this figure so that he's walking toward the left, while this figure is not walking, he's just standing still. This pose is seen from the side, while this pose is seen from the front. And the woman back here is seen from a three-quarter view. So all the poses of the figures are different. They contrast in terms of poses. Now, this figure wears a helmet, whereas this one doesn't. So again, there is contrast. There are differences. This figure holds a knife, while this one holds onto a sword. The costume on this figure looks different than the costume on this figure. So again, there is a contrast of costumes. There are different degrees of contrast, but the strongest contrasts, the ones that make for the greatest differences are the ones that are discords, as I mentioned earlier, if you remember. So those elements that appear to be discords within this picture are, for example, the color. The blue color is a strong contrasting color to the other colors found elsewhere in the picture, which are basically yellow-orange. There are variations of yellow-orange. So some of the colors may look more like browns, but nevertheless, they're basically yellow-orange. Also, the size of this figure is much larger than the size of the other figures, and therefore, in terms of size, this figure is a discord, a strong contrast to the smaller sizes, especially to the woman here. You can also refer to these three different ways of combining things as, for example, where repetition is, as unity. And then harmony can be referred to as variety. And discord can be referred to as contrast. They all basically mean the same thing. Harmony gives you variety. Repetition gives you unity. Unity is achieved through repetition. And discord is an extreme contrast, while contrast can also refer to different degrees of contrast. Let me go back to the version in which I repeated the forms or figures. Here, there's too much unity. Unity achieved through repetition. It's not interesting. When you have too much unity, you don't have maximum interest. To get more interest, you need to apply harmony like this. To get maximum interest, then you need to add greater degrees of contrast, like in this example. Contrast really adds a lot of interest and excitement to a picture. There is a danger, however, when you add too much contrast, when you have too much variety within a picture, that the picture then will have a disunity rather than a unity. Therefore, in order to achieve unity, in spite of the contrast that is added, the principle of dominance that you see here needs to be applied. It is through dominance that unity can be achieved. And within unity, there needs to be contrast. But like I said, if there's too much contrast, you destroy unity. And in order to regain unity, dominance needs to be applied. And I'll show you how that's done. In spite of the many contrasts or novelties that I've introduced into this picture, there is unity. Design is the integration of opposing forces or contrasts, integrating those contrasts, and thereby achieving unity. I should mention that some of the things that I'm showing you in various videos are repeated in other videos throughout the course, so that you'll be reminded of these things, and you'll see other examples which will further help you in understanding all of this.